the China Aerospace Science and Technology Company held a conference in August of 2023 in which they basically said, we have figured out how to send people not only to Mars, but beyond to Jupiter, Saturn, and the rest of the solar system. So the Chinese Communist Party has told us that it wants to dominate our entire solar system. So you could have China and the United States basically trying to land on the same landing zone, but China, with its moon bombing moonlander, could aim that booster stage to actually attack the American moon landing site. If we have, so yes, in my opinion, the Chinese manned space program is a military manned space program and should be a target for the United States and other democracies.
Welcome, viewers. The space frontier is becoming more and more hostile. China's 2007 Shenzhou launch marked the opening salvo in a cosmic gambit. With bases from Arctic, Argentina to Djibouti, the CCP prepares for high ground dominance. Unlikely players Taiwan and the Falklands are now pawns in this cosmic chess match. Is the West already losing the new space race against the CCP's relentless rise? Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Rick Fisher, who's a senior fellow with the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Rick, welcome to the show.
Richard, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again. Today we have a different topic than last time. I wanted to talk with you about the space because a lot is going on and it seems like China is way ahead of the West. Could you tell us about the differences between the American and Chinese space exploration?
The American space exploration program is led largely by a civilian agency, National Aeronautics and Space Agency, or NASA, since the beginning of the 1960s. NASA has done a pretty good job of separating its functions, its activities from the American military. And while, yes, military pilots were largely the source of all the early astronauts, the astronaut pool certainly expanded to other fields as the United States and Russia began building and manning the International Space Station by the mid to late 1990s. NASA remains a civilian agency under our, I believe, transportation department. And Americans are quite happy with that. In 2020, President Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump formed the Space Force, which was a belated American acknowledgement of how our potential adversaries were already long before using space for military functions, but actually planning and preparing for combat in low Earth orbit and beyond. Now, China, in contrast, you have unity between the Communist Party and the military, that the People's Liberation Army, will control all of China's space activities. And that's the way it's been from the beginning, from the early 1980s, when China started launching satellites and then offering commercial launch services. And then in the early 1990s, when it lashed up with the former Soviet Union, imported a lot of technology and began its second attempt at a manned space program. All of this, manned space capsules, small space stations, large space stations, to China's ambition to put people on the moon before the end of this decade. All of this is controlled by the People's Liberation Army. And the arm of the People's Liberation Army that will control all of this activity was just announced on Friday, April 19, just last week. It is now called the People's Liberation Army Aerospace Force. The Aerospace Force is actually a victory for the PLA Air Force, which wanted to control the first Space Force that was formed in 2015. That didn't work out. Instead, the rocket faction, or the General Equipment Department, took early control of the first Space Force. Now China is into its second Space Force, and that will include assets that have been developed and are being developed by the PLA Air Force to dominate near space, or the area just below low Earth orbit, and then, of course, the rocket faction, which will try to control low Earth orbit, cislunar space, the moon, Mars, and eventually the rest of our solar system. The China Aerospace Science and Technology Company held a conference in August of 2023 in which they basically said, we have figured out how to send people not only to Mars, but beyond, to Jupiter, Saturn, and the rest of the solar system. So the Chinese Communist Party has told us that it wants to dominate our entire solar system.
Most of us are probably familiar with the US Soviet space race, but it looks like the Chinese are much more aggressive and, have a different vision. Is it so we could say that it's a totally different quality than with the Soviets? We are on another level, and now, unfortunately, the West and the US, is it behind China in terms of development and progress?
I wouldn't say we're behind. I mean, what China has done in the last decade, Richard, is basically develop space technologies that are on a par with that of the United States. They may not have Falcon 9 or Starship heavy space launch vehicles like the American SpaceX Corporation, but they will very soon. The Long March 10, that will be their first manned moon space launcher, expected to start testing in 2025 or 2026, is about the same size and capability as the SpaceX Falcon 9. And by the mid 2030s, China hopes to develop its Long March 9, which will essentially be, or eventually be, very similar to the SpaceX Starship, able to loft 50 to 100 tons to low Earth orbit or even the moon. But the Chinese program, in comparison to the American program, is much more focused. China has also the luxury of a dictatorship to continue to fund its moon program as it starts wars on Earth that could easily divert funding from the American program. I mean, if China started a war on the Taiwan Strait, at the same time Russia started a war against Poland, all American military forces would be diverted. We would be in a crisis. We would be at war. We wouldn't be spending money on going to the moon. We would be fighting these wars that would probably blossom into 2 to 4 wars very quickly. China, on the other hand, will likely continue to fund its moon program because it's focused and because the technological goals are rather small in comparison to the technology goals of the United States. I mean, China is essentially combining the lessons of the American Apollo program and the Soviet moon program that never made it. Uh, China has acquired much of the technology for the first Soviet moon landing vehicle, and that has informed the Chinese design for a moon landing vehicle. Namely, the Russian vehicle uh, came in two parts: the manned moon lander and a large booster vehicle. The booster vehicle was designed to help the lander get to lunar orbit, but then to slow the lander down so that it could land. And when it had reached a pretty low altitude over the moon, the booster would then detach from the lander and crash into the surface of the moon. This is what the Chinese moon lander is also designed to do. It has this booster stage that will crash into the moon when its function is completed, creating a rather significant hazard to everybody else who's trying to get to the surface of the moon or is already on the surface of the moon. And this becomes pretty interesting when you consider that the United States and China are both intently targeting a certain portion of the moon, the South Pole, because they both believe that it has the highest probability of containing lunar ice, which can be processed into water, oxygen, other things that we need to exist and even to get to Mars. So you could have China and the United States basically trying to land on the same landing zone, but China, with its moon bombing moon lander, could aim that booster stage to actually attack the American moon landing site. And if we have people there, well, that's cause for war on the moon, which, by the way, is in violation of treaties governing conduct on the moon, so it would be most illegal.
This is the channel where world's top experts on Asian politics and security discuss recent and future events.
Now, someone could say, oh, why would China behave so aggressively? But I think what most of our viewers probably don't know is maybe you could explain it to us, the first Shenzhou mission in 2007 and how the Chinese unit approached the American ISS. Maybe that would be a good introduction of the Chinese approach, how it differs from the American.
Well, China's space and moon program is designed to help the Chinese Communist Party achieve hegemony on Earth. I mean, consider this. I mean, we're really talking in kind of Star Wars terms. China wants to control the moon so that it can control cislunar space. So if you control cislunar space, then you can control low Earth orbit. And control of low Earth orbit means you can dominate battles, wars on Earth. You can be victorious in most or all of your wars on Earth. And this is what the Chinese Communist Party wants. So the PLA has been in charge of the manned program and now manned moon program and soon manned Mars program. In 2003, when China sent its first person into space, that person, Yang Liwei, was the secondary payload for the Shenzhou 5 mission. The primary payload were two large optical cameras that were taking pictures as the Shenzhou circled the Earth. And you mentioned, the Shenzhou 7 mission, I believe. This was the first mission in which a spacewalker emerged from the capsule. This was a big deal, received a lot of press in China and around the world. But about 45 minutes after the spacewalk, which only lasted a few minutes. The Shenzhou space capsule launched a microsatellite, or you might consider fired a microsatellite, because the space capsule then passed within 45 kilometers of the International Space Station. So, here you have a spacecraft and it fires this satellite traveling 17,000 miles an hour, and it zooms right past the International Space Station. 2 Russians and 1 American were on board at the time. Imagine some car throwing a rock at 17,000 miles an hour in front of your house. That's essentially what happened. And passing within 45 kilometers of the ISS, the Chinese knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that that was the size of the warning zone around the ISS. Anything coming within that 45 kilometer square box would trigger alarms and instantly trigger ground controllers to move the ISS to get out of the way. In my opinion, this was a simulated interception of the International Space Station. The Chinese viewed the ISS as a potential military target, which means they regard their space station that has been traveling up there for about 2 years now as our military target. And they've used stolen, in my opinion, stolen Russian space station technology to build a space station that looks like the old Soviet Mir station. A lot of modules connected to a center core, modules that can be replaced by modules armed with missiles, bombs, guns, whatever they want. One of the modules already on the Chinese space station has I would just call it a bomb bay. It's a space where they can put almost anything, including bombs, if they wanted to drop on Earth targets. So yes, in my opinion, the Chinese manned space program is a military manned space program and should be a target for the United States and other democracies.
I know you did also some research at that time, and it turned out the US government wasn't very much transparent with what went down, or rather up at
No,
this moment, right?
yeah. I found out about this from a Russian space issue webpage. A person there had actually understood that the Chinese Shenzhou craft was going to fly very close to the ISS, and they were able to determine that basically right after it was launched. I don't know who that Russian was speaking with, possibly friends in their space defense bureaucracy. But at any rate, yeah. So this happened, and the day after, I reached out to the NASA public relations to see if they had any comment on this, and the person there got back to me and said, "Oh well, we have to refer this to our Space Defense Command, North American Air Defense Command," which they did. In about 2 days, I received another reply confirming that the Chinese spacecraft had indeed passed within a close distance of the ISS. Now, what concerned me is that the United States nor the Russian government issued any statement about this incident. I viewed this as a very hostile act, but 2 governments that had the most to lose were saying nothing about it. And I would add, to date, all these years after that, I believe, 2008 space flight, the American or Russian governments have said nothing about it.
So we have a kind of a balloon situation. The government just, if it wouldn't be for the citizens, we wouldn't know.
Right.
Okay, that's great. So far you discussed the lunar and the space elements, but there is a lot going on Earth. So the Chinese are building out their bases, let's say the one better known in Argentina, then a lot is going on in Antarctica and in Djibouti. Could you bring all this together? Because that's all also very important for how they want to use laser weapons and direct their rockets or missiles. So that all is one thing together with with what's going on in space, right?
Okay, yes. Ground tracking and control stations are on Earth are essential to manage satellite constellations, manned space activities, and manned and unmanned activities on the moon. China has a fleet of space tracking and control ships that it uses to supplement its kind of lack of ground control bases. Now, China does have a global ground control tracking network, and its most controversial ground control station is located in Argentina, a result of an agreement with the former Argentine president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. She entered into an agreement that includes a 50-year lease that is very hard for the current Argentine government, anti-communist government of President Milei. It's going to be very hard for him to get out of it. He's trying to exercise a clause of the agreement that would allow Argentina to actually inspect the base, see what's going on a few times a year. But of course, the Chinese aren't going to agree to that because the Chinese don't believe in any kind of military transparency. And they're definitely not going to respect the wishes of a democratic government anywhere on this planet that government can send people into their space tracking and control center, which, by the way, is actually controlled by the new PLA Aerospace Force.
From what I know, there is a clause in this agreement that when when a hosting government, let's say Argentina in this case, violates it, they start renegotiating all other agreements that China does have with Argentina. So it might come at a very high cost because the previous government signed it and agreed to it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the Chinese are very good at using all the leverage that they had. And of course, they've been giving loans and aid to Argentina, especially to the Peronist side of politics in Argentina. So yes, they have fantastic leverage over the Argentine government, and this should be a lesson to nations around the earth. When you enter into these deals with China, they're going to make sure that they're totally enforceable and that you can't get out of them, or they're going to make it very painful for you to get out of them. But this space tracking and control facility, and one that they plan to build in Antarctica, are important today because China is now developing and building something called the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. These are actually space launch vehicles equipped with Earth bombing nuclear warheads, hypersonic glide vehicles, that instead of going north over the North Pole to attack the United States, instead go the long way south over Antarctica and then back north over Latin America to attack the United States from a southern trajectory, which is very undefended. So when the FOBS missiles go south and go over Antarctica and back up the other side, they'll be able to receive guidance updates from the space tracking and control base in Argentina. And in a sense, the PLA Aerospace base in Argentina will help conduct nuclear war strikes against the United States.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
So that's one part. We also have the station in Djibouti, where the Chinese government recently signed a 1 billion deal to build a space launch facility with up to 7 space launch platforms by 2028.
Well, that,
Um,
that agreement did not materialize.
oh,
I mean,
okay.
there were certainly reports that it was going to happen. I wrote an article or two about that, and somehow, about I'd say a month after the deal was announced, it sort of died. Now, the Chinese are, if anything, persistent, and they may try to revive this deal. It certainly behooves the United States and other governments to try to convince the government in Djibouti, a pretty squirrely lot, not to enter into this deal. We'll see. I mean, the Chinese are very persistent, and they will definitely try again to build a space base in Djibouti.
Good. There is still two components I want to bring into it. There is Taiwan and the Falkland Islands. What's their role in this equation for China?
Well, of course, all that China is doing in space eventually adds up to its ability to prosecute its future war against Taiwan. The space program is designed to achieve dominance in low Earth orbit, to attack and disable American satellite networks, navigation satellites, surveillance satellites, early warning satellites against nuclear attack, and of course, Taiwan's few surveillance satellites. Once the enemy satellites are out of the way, it'll be easier for Chinese satellites then to guide attacking missiles, aircraft, ship, what have you. That's the plan. And China is designing its space program so that once it controls low Earth orbit, it will also by that time control cislunar space and make it very difficult for the Americans to try to regain any substantive or decisive access to low Earth orbit. So Taiwan is largely the justification for the Communist Party to militarize space. The Falklands would have been a second war that China would have funded for Argentina. Back in the early 2010s and really by 2015, Argentina was right on the cusp of several major weapons deals with China. 24 multi-role jet fighters, about 100 wheeled armored vehicles, 5 corvettes armed with anti-ship missiles. And that would have been the first round. China would have followed this up probably with sales of submarines, longer range missiles, anti aircraft missiles. And of course, by that time, China would have had naval access to Argentine ports and would have been sending ships and aircraft to help defend Argentina, if you will, as it launched on its second war to try to retake the Falklands Islands. All of this was in the works. China and elements in the Peronist side of Argentine politics were working very hard over the last decade to make this happen. But this projection has been halted by the victory of President Milei. And President Milei is now actively building a new strategic alignment with the United States, with NATO, and the West. He's just purchased American fighter jets to rearm the Argentine Air Force, is looking into other arms deals with the United States, and is also asking about becoming a partner of the NATO alliance. mean, ideally, the United States should be considering asking our British allies, why don't we consider diffusing the appeal of the Falklands War, the resentment from the Falklands War that is still very powerful in Argentina, by opening the Falklands up to multilateral military uses? Why not build a radar in the Falklands that can track the Chinese FOBs missiles? And Russia is also building this kind of weapon system. Put a big radar down there, offer it to be jointly manned by Argentine, Chilean, Brazilian, Peruvian technicians. Turn it into a confidence building exercise instead of letting it fester as a source of resentment and future conflict.
Good. I still have two questions. One is, I said at the beginning, my impression is that China is ahead of us. I mean, they have the resources, commitment, they have a long-term vision, they have the infrastructure, like the manufacturing base, engineers, all that kind of stuff that the West has less and less of because we outsourced it. So my question is, again, I will ask you, don't you think that from what we just heard, that the Chinese are ahead of us on this next frontier?
Well, they could arrive ahead of us very quickly, Richard. I will say that. If the United States is allowed to pursue its moon program, if the allies that it has gathered under the Artemis Accords results in cooperation agreements that sees a dozen or more countries actually put either equipment or people on the moon, then American leadership can successfully deter China from initiating conflict on the moon. I mean, we'll be there in various ways and with enough people, enough bases, so that we could use dual use equipment like mining lasers, which I fully expect the Chinese to do for military defensive missions. So we can basically create on the moon the same kind of stalemate that we have on Earth. But of course, stalemates are expensive. They require continued investment. And that's where we are. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Chinese, because they're focused, because their goals are limited in a sense, they could very easily take the lead. It's up to us not to let that happen.
My last question would be, what will you be researching and looking at in 24-25? What should we be expecting to happen maybe in this area?
Well, my targets are varied. Yeah, I always am. I try to be conscious of Chinese military modernization trends, activities that the Chinese are engaged in Asia. I mean, against Japan, against Korea. I'm always following Chinese nuclear proliferation activities, especially to North Korea and Pakistan, and I'm paying increasing attention to the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis and how this axis, largely led by China, is now beginning to initiate wars for the purpose of exhausting the West that will allow China to better prepare for its war against Taiwan.
Rick, thank you so much for your time and really very interesting insights.
Richard, it's always a privilege to join you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.